well, we're going to talk about the strategies. I by no means have all the answers, but at least have worked with a lot of plants. I want to share some of those experiences so that it might help you if you're going to start up a plant, or if you have a plant you just started up. Some things that might help you succeed. Of course, this is a schematic of a plant. It shows all the different parts of a plant. So this is how complicated a plant can become. When you're doing biodiesel, there's some important questions you should be asking yourself. A lot of people say, well, I want to be a small producer. You know, how big should I build the plant? You know, what kind of plant? Where should we get the feedstock? What kind of cost is it going to be? Because feedstock is an important part. And we're going to cover each one of these in future slides. You need to have a market. You have to know, where you get your feedstock, how you're going to produce it, where you're going to sell it. And then, of course, you're going to have byproducts. I've had a lot of plants that started up, never thought about the glycerin until the tank was full, and then they had to shut down because they had a full tank of glycerin and nothing to do with it. And you want to do it safely while protecting the environment, and of course, you want to make a profit. If you're not going to make a profit, why be in business? As far as the plant size, a lot of times you can let your feedstock determine your plant size. If you're a small producer, how much feedstock do you have? You wouldn't want to build a 5 million gallon plant if you only have enough feedstock to feed a 1 million gallon plant or a 500,000 gallon plant. So you want to find out where your feedstock is. So you have to do your homework up front, make sure you find which is the feedstock you want to use, where you can find the various feedstocks. You also want to look at your market size. Are you going to be a regional, a local, just a city, or do you want to go statewide, multi-state? That's all going to determine what size plant you build. Another thing you can do is, a lot of people say they'll look at a plant size and someone will talk them in, well, economies of scale, you want to go bigger. Your price per gallon of producing is going to be less. Well, before you jump to that thinking, you can always build a small plant and expand it. That way, what mistakes you make in the small plant, you can improve in the next version or the additional plants that you add on to it. And also, look at your financial resources. As a rule of thumb, for every gallon of capacity, it's roughly $1.
That capacity over like a year, or what? I mean, like a year's capacity, right?
Different annual capacity. I did a lot of research looking at how much plants cost, and that's of course where people say, oh, well, look how much, for a 30 million gallon plant, it only cost me $25 million, but for, let's say, a 15 million gallon plant, it cost me almost, what, 16 million? Well, for that little bit more, I get a lot more capacity, but again, where are you going to get the feedstock? Where's your market? How are you going to feed it? The other thing to gather from this graph, as you can see, it does get cheaper, but also your FFA content. The higher the FFA, the more expensive the plant's going to cost. And then something that came in about 5-6 years ago were modular plants. And what they are plants that people build in a warehouse and they deliver to the site. If you have to construct the plant on site, it's going to be very expensive. And a lot of times, if you go to some of the big producers of plants, the ones that build these 30 million gallon plants, and say, I want you to build me a 1 million gallon plant, they're going to quote you a price of them coming to your site, building every piece of structure, all the tanks on site, and it's going to be outrageously priced. So if you're thinking of a small plant, which most of us are, look at these modular plants. They can be pre-built, all assembled, skid mounted, truck delivered, and it makes it very cheap to get a plant. So if you look at the very bottom here, all of a sudden these all start merging together and it's more straight line. So your actual cost per gallon is fairly low down in this area. So if you're thinking small plant, modular ways to go. Feedstock type. Animal fats versus seed oils. Those are your two main categories. Here's some things to consider, which way you want to go. Animal fats are usually less expensive than seed oils on the average. But they also have higher sulfur content, lower or no sulfur, although there's always exceptions in either one of these categories. Seed oils, they're usually less than 5% FFA. Animal fats, a lot of times they can be 5 to 50%, depending if you're going with brown grease, yellow grease, what kind of animal fat. They're less available because, of course, seed oil is a lot more available. There's a lot more uses for that. These have to come from animals, so if you're not slaughtering a lot of animals, you're not going to have a lot of fats. Has a higher gel temperature, which means all of a sudden you're going to have to worry about your biodiesel. You can have problems with it. It's more stable because they're saturated. So with a lot of these, especially like soybean oil, has a lot of triple bonds. You have to add some type of stabilizer in there to make it stable so it doesn't degrade and it also meets the characteristics. The other thing you have to think about is steroglucosides. This will come out in your testing for ASTM. Seed oils have higher steroglucosides, so usually you have to work with those. Whereas animal fats have lower, and sometimes you don't have to worry about it or put an extra step in. There's ways of taking care of steroglucosides for small amounts other than chilling it down and filtering. I just threw this in. I put together a program that calculates the cost of manufacturing. And I got all this information from various engineering groups, and they gave me formulas. I used the stoichiometric formulas, and I calculated down to how many watts and everything else to calculate prices. But the main thing I want you to gather from this, feedstock is by 4. It's 85% of the cost of the plant, of the production of the biodiesel. So therefore, when people say, well, should I hire 2 people or 4 people? I show them this graph and say, well, look at labor. It's that small 2.3 slice. I'd worry about your feedstock. Put more of your time in finding the feedstock you want to run in the plant and how cheap you can get it. Sources of feedstock. There's always alternate sources. A good point is off-spec feedstock. I have one company in Iowa that goes and buys up vegetable oil that's packaged in 1-liter containers for the grocery store. Something was wrong with the label. So then he buys it, pours all that in a tank, and then throws away the recycles the plastic. But he buys off-spec oil. Down in Texas, there's a plant that buys cottonseed oil that's off-spec. Those producers of those oils, they don't want to mess with an off-spec oil. If they can't blend it off in other batches, they'll tend to sell it for a little bit cheaper. So look for some of those off-spec feedstocks. You can collect the waste vegetable oil yourself and pre-treat it. Buy products from other industries. We had a plant in Iowa that worked with pig skins, and they produced an oil that was, when they treated the skins, there was a water that had an oil, and they would centrifuge it, pull off the oil, and they had what they called A and B grease. A grease was about 90%, 94% pure grease. Now the B grease was like about 50-50. And so they were either land applying it to get rid of it, or paying for the waste treatment plant to take that oil to use it to grow bugs in that and help them with their system. So when they approached me and says, well, can we sell this to biodiesel? I mean, right now we're paying the transportation and send it to some place to get rid of it. If we could sell it and make a penny off of it, or if someone would pick up the transportation, we'd like to market in that direction. So that was another source of oil that people didn't think about. So check some of the industries around town. I've worked with ethanol plants that get bee starch that comes out of some of these plants from making soda pop and that. They have side streams that they can send to make ethanol. And then the other one is grow new crops. And then find somebody to toll crush it for you so that you can get the oil. A lot of times they can use the meal for other things, and they'll do a fairly good pricing structure. So check on crops. There's a lot of that going around with camelina, jatropha. There's a lot of places that are starting to grow these non-food type crops so that they have oil that's not competing with the food industry. batch size, plant size consideration. A batch plant costs less than a continuous plant. That's because it takes less equipment. You can use the same piece of equipment for multiple operations. You could use your reactor and also washing your reactor, use it for a separating tank. So you can do a lot in one piece of equipment, whereas continuous, you have to have a piece of equipment for each stage. The other thing with continuous is if you run a continuous plant, you have to run the whole thing. You can't stop it here and say, okay, I'm going to store all this until the next day. So basically, continuous plants make their money by running around the clock 24/7 most of the days of the year, maybe 10 days a year that they set aside for maintenance. So when small producers, a lot of time, the question they say, should I go continuous batch? I say, do you want to run it around the clock, or do you want to go home at 5 o'clock and maybe come back the next day? A batch plant, you can shut it down and turn it back on. There's few operations like distillation of methanol that you really can't shut down right away and start back up. There's other ways of doing it, like maybe a still. But if you have a distillation column, it takes a while for it to get up to equilibrium. It takes a while to shut down. I did a calculation between a continuous plant and a batch plant. Between a 10 million gallon batch plant and a 30 million gallon continuous plant. And the batch plant was cheaper in making biodiesel than the continuous if you had to shut that down a couple times a month. Because when you shut a continuous plant down, it takes a while to ramp down and a while to ramp back up till it hits equilibrium. Until it hits that equilibrium, it's making product off spec. So you're going to have to recycle it, so you lose anywhere from 8 hours of production on the front end and 8 hours in the back end every time you shut that down. Whereas a batch plant, you can stop it, or if it's something that you can let settle overnight, you can come back to it and then run it that way. I actually know of a 30 million gallon batch plant, which everybody says, oh, those plants all. They did a batch and they said it worked great for them. So the batch plant footprint is always a lot smaller. And well, nowadays when they're starting to talk modular plants, they can do some small things in continuous that they can make a smaller footprint. But usually a batch plant has a smaller footprint, and that could be of concern to you. You can operate it for shorter periods of time. I told you about the turning it on and off and about the continuous. Some other things, if you have a small plant, safety is most important. Good example, if you're going to be doing biodiesel in your garage, that's a no-no. If the fire marshal hears about that, you're going to be in trouble. If you burn down your garage because you have a fire or something, your insurance probably won't cover you. So, and you probably don't have explosion-proof light switches in your garage, and you should have that anywhere you're working with methanol or flammable substance. So, be very careful. They had a number of plants in Montana that blew up and destroyed people's garages. Didn't hurt anybody, but they lost their insurance, their house, and it was just detrimental to them. So if you build a plant, make sure you take the safety considerations. Flammability, hazardous, methanol is hazardous substance. You have to treat it properly. You can't be throwing stuff down the drain. So things like that. Consider all those safety things for a small plant. That's where batch plants are preferred for small, because continuous is just too expensive. The quality of biodiesel produced, you have to be concerned about that. You can make quality biodiesel in a 55-gallon drum if you do it right. You might have to overshoot on the time a little, maybe run it a little bit longer, maybe add a little more catalyst, a little more methanol. But you can do all this stuff in relatively small containers. You just have to realize what the shortcomings are and know your process. Know the chemistry, know what's going on in that reaction so you can control it so you make a good product. The other thing that you want to be concerned about is regulations and taxes. Not only the legal regulations, like you have to register with EPA, you have to worry about submitting fuel tax, especially if you're selling it. Some states allow you to exempt 400 gallons that you can make for yourself and not have to pay a fuel tax. But you have to worry about all those regulations and taxes. Environmental regulations, the EPA, they're always concerned about methanol escaping in the vapors into the atmosphere, so you have to be cognizant of that. Make sure you get all your permits and registration. Wisconsin was a great state. We actually did a tour around Wisconsin and for small farm producers. And we talked to them what the law required. The actual taxing agency came around and says, you know, you have to put in this form. We'll let you file quarterly because you're a small producer and you're exempt from 400 gallons and you don't have to pay tax on that. And you have to fill out this permit. In Iowa, they have a one-stop shop. You go to one person and they help you with all the permits you need for your business. You don't have to go to each agency and figure out. That's what more states should be doing. So if you can work with your state in that area, let your local fire marshal know that you're building, you have a plan. They have soft water. You don't want to use hard water because of the minerals in it. That can cause problems with your quality. Another question, one thing about quality is why do you want quality? Well, if you're going to go after a blender's credit, if you're going to go after any of the government incentives, they usually have somewhere in the law must meet ASTM specification. So if you don't meet that, you can't prove that you don't meet it, then you can't get that incentive. So if you're not going after the incentives, well, if you don't make ASTM quality and you're using it yourself, you're hurting only yourself. But if you make it and sell it to somebody else, now you're crossing that little line that's going to make the government look at you a lot closer. You open yourself up for liabilities. You know, you can get sued if your engine blows up. They'll go back to their manufacturer and say, "Oh, you ran B20, and he made have him show us the quality of that biodiesel." And if you don't have that test to show, you can run into problems. So you want to wash. You can use this shower head type where you sprinkle water on top of your biodiesel and it goes through and washes it out. And then you can do that over and over for a while and change the water and do it a second time until the water's clear. You can use counter current flow, where the biodiesel comes in one way and water comes the other way and they pass each other. So obviously you put your cleanest water in the very end, where the cleanest biodiesel will be by the time it gets there, and then the dirtier water will come out at the front end where your dirtiest biodiesel goes in. You can bubble nitrogen through. We say nitrogen rather than air, because if you're using some type of feedstock that has triple or double bonds, it can degrade rather quickly, especially if it's warm and you're bubbling air through it. That's oxygen. You can use absorbent. Yes?
How expensive is it to do the bubbling nitrogen? Is it cost effective?
Well, technically, when you store biodiesel, you should have nitrogen above the biodiesel too. So if you're going to have nitrogen, you can buy nitrogen. You can actually get units that'll pull nitrogen out of the air, because the air is like 80% nitrogen anyway. So you can get those units, or you can buy tanks of nitrogen. But to be truthful, I'd probably, I'd look at my feedstock and say, well, can I get by with air if I do it quickly? I'd probably look at one of the other ones and not use the bubbling if I wasn't going to have nitrogen anyway, just to save, the hassle of dealing with the nitrogen. You can use absorbents to clean your biodiesel. Sawdust is a popular one. You can buy commercial absorbents. You can buy absorbents that will actually take out a little free fatty acid. So if you check your biodiesel and it's just below the spec, you can buy a resin that will take it out. The only disadvantage is it's not cheap, so you wouldn't want to use it all the time unless you had to bring that batch in the spec. But you can use absorbents. You have to worry about contaminating them, or glycerin blinding them, or soap blinding them. So if you have a lot of soap, water washing seems to be the more forgiving one. You can use a resin bed. Absorbents like Magnasol you can throw in the tank. You have to mix it up and then filter out the absorbent.
And there's a new version of Magnasol now called C400. You don't have to do that.
Oh, okay.
It's a 400 micron version of it. You just put it in your dry wash tower.
Okay. So there's absorbents and resin beds that you can use. Thank you for that information.
Is there a price comparison to the old stuff?
I don't know whether it was the same cost or,
Anybody sell that? I mean, where do you get it?
Buy it from manufacturer, direct.
Okay.
The Dallas group.
If you're thinking about doing either absorbance or Recipents, the University of Idaho they had a grad student that worked on different absorbents to find out, is sawdust as good as Magnusol and some of these other ones? And they actually tested a bunch of them, and they showed it was, did a pretty good job by itself. So you could look at the University of Idaho's website and pull down that paper.
Rudy, do you have a name of the resin that you can polish out a little bit of FFAs with?
It's made by Magnusol.
Magnusol makes it.
Yeah.
C400.
That's not a resin though, is it?
No, it's an
It's
absorbent.
magnesium silicate, but it.
Right, but you mentioned a resin.
Well, it's an absorbent. It's really not.
So
a
that
It's
resin.
a dry wash
C400.
media.
Yeah, it's a dry wash.
Magnusol was the original, but it's a super fine powder that you got to filter out with 1 micron filters. They came up with a new version called C400, which looks more like sand.
Understood. Does that take out the FFA then? You get an FFA reduction with C400 with Magnusol?
You have to talk to them about that. I
I
mean,
don't remember
they
off
make
the top of
different
my head.
varieties.
It get down some of the soap and stuff.
Yeah, it does great on soap, but not on acid.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm wanting to.
Yeah, there's
hear about.
one variety. They have multiple varieties. There's one variety, and they'll say it'll help with free fatty acid. They try not to make a claim that's going to take it all out. It's sort of similar to what they throw in fryers when they start going bad. It helps retard the fatty acid production. Well, this one will help absorb some of that.
So you're okay, and you're thinking of an absorbent that does that
Yeah.
rather than a bead,
Right.
like on the mountain.
Different methanol removal methods. A flash evaporator is usually pretty easy, cheap to make. It'll take out the bulk of the methanol. It'll allow you to take out the methanol. It's going to be wet. It's not going to be, it might be 90% pure methanol and 10% water. It doesn't separate the methanol and water, but it does remove the bulk of it. And so you can remove it from both the biodiesel and the glycerin. And if you could use this flash evaporator for both if you wanted to, if you're doing a batch operation. You could use a still, and that's where you just put the stuff in there and boil it off like you're making alcohol and boil off the methanol. That's usually pretty good, but it's time consuming. It's usually a small batch. You can use distillation column, but that's a continuous process. You have to ramp that up and then ramp it back down. So if you were going to go with distillation column and you're doing a batch plant, you'd probably want to store a lot of your wet methanol until you have enough stored that you can fire the column up, run it, and bring it back. A lot of times small producers don't want to mess with that. So there are places that you can send your glycerin with the methanol in for them to recover it, or send them to your methanol, and they have a distillation column that's not being used all the time. They'll run it and then send you back, pure or very almost virgin methanol that you can then use. So, and of course they charge you something. They'll buy your methanol for a certain price and then sell you clean or dry methanol back at 10 cents more or whatever more they want to charge. But you can't find places like that. In fact, we have a couple places that are actually starting to build to actually, their only job is to take people's glycerin in and refine it.
You can buy a media to dry out your methanol, and it's rechargeable. So it's you can buy it once, and you can just use it over and over and over, and it'll take all the water out.
That's like a molecular sieve.
I don't remember. Yeah, it is a molecular sieve. That's
Yeah.
exactly what it is.
It's
which one that is.
Get a hold. Yeah. Did you already get my code?
Okay.
Send me an email and I'll tell you which.
That's what they use in the ethanol industry, because you can't distill ethanol to 99.9 because it forms an azeotrope, so you have to use a sieve to separate it. So they're starting to, in fact, last year was the first year I saw methanol sieve people at the Biodiesel conference.
And then all you got to do is run it in an oven and dry it out, or put it out in the sun, and then so it's continually, the molecular sieve is continually reusable.
The caution I would have there is if you put it in an oven to dry out, there's always some residual methanol on it. You have to be worried about the flammability. in a plant operation, what they do is they'll pass the methanol vapor through, which has some water vapor in it, and then it goes to the molecular sieve, the methanol goes, the water gets trapped, and then they'll reverse it and run hot, dry methanol vapor through to take the water out. And they'll put it back in, and then it'll just keep going back and forth and eventually take the water out that way. But that's how they dry it out. So be cognizant on how you're going to dry it out, because there will be methanol in that sieve, and you don't want to blow yourself up. The non-recoverable methods would be a water wash. You can wash your biodiesel or take the methanol out, but then what do you do with the water? If you're not going to distill it, which if you're doing a water wash, you have way too much water. It'll take you forever to distill it. So usually you can pour that down the drain. Well, you don't want to pour it down the drain, but you can use it for other applications, or put it in with your glycerin, and then whoever you sell your glycerin to gets some of that wash water.
10 minutes.
Okay. Well, I started late, of course. Problem solving tips: make test batches in the lab. You know, if you're looking at a new feedstock, do it in the lab. You're going to find out how it works. It'll give you how much methanol to use, how much catalyst to use, how it's going to work. Make it wrong in the lab. Once you see if you make something with too much free fatty acid and turn it to soap, turn it to jello, then you see, hey, that's what it looks like. Then you figure out how to bring it back. Use acid to break it to bring it back. Because if you do it in your reactor, what are you going to do? Go in there with a spoon and scoop it out? You're going to have to bring it back. Do mass balances just to figure out where all the products are going, so that you know if you have this much water coming in, geez, that's too much water. Where's it going out in? And so you can figure out what's coming in, where it's going out. Use a visual appearance. You know, when you look at your biodiesel, you can tell if it's clean or not. Your glycerin. Yeah, that's your first check of quality. Know that it affects the temperature on your process and reactions. You can do a lot of stuff at lower temperatures. It just takes longer. And as a small producer, you have that option of trading time for equipment or temperature. So you can do those things, but you have to realize what it's going to take. If you say, I want to run it at room temperature, it's going to take you 8 hours to make a batch of biodiesel. No, if you know that and you've tested it in the lab, you'll have a good idea. You can say, well, okay, I want to run this, and I'll know that in 8 hours I'll have a batch. Free fatty acids can be a problem. Always be concerned about that, how that's going to cause problems. Minimize the water in the reaction phase. That's going to cause free fatty acid. It's going to cause all kinds of other problems. You want to be under 500 parts per million of water coming in from your feedstock, your methoxide, if you made it, you have water in it, and your methanol, in case you have wet methanol. Know your process and equipment. A lot of times I'll get people call up and they say, hey, I'm running this and it's not working right. Well, did you know that this is taking place in there? No, I didn't. Well, understand what reactions are taking place in there. That'll help a lot. Your feedstock determines your biodiesel properties. I always think that we're going to get to a point where we're going to have designer biodiesel, where you can tell what free fatty acid chain lengths you want to put in, what triglycerides you want to put in, and that's going to make your biodiesel with the properties that you want. Obviously, you know, if you want to use it for jet fuel, it has to have a very cold, be able to not precipitate at cold temperatures, because planes up there get kind of cold. So how do you do that? You know, what chain lengths you do? Do you want to winterize your diesel? I know someone in Nebraska that was running 100% biodiesel year-round in their car. When it went down to 19 below, they were using 100% biodiesel. The wife was filling the car. She made the biodiesel. She knew to take it off the top of the drum where it was still liquid. Husband filled the car once, stuck the pump a little further down, filled it up with all this stuff that wasn't quite, you know, winterized, plugged all the lines. So after he did that a couple of times, she wouldn't let him fill the car anymore. So that's just, you know, there's ways, if you understand that, say, well, hey, if I leave this drum sit out in the barn, it's going to, all the crystals going to fall out. The stuff on the top hasn't crystallized. It's good to that temperature. Soap production is is difficult to remove. That's why we want you to remove the free fatty acid up front. Soap mixes with the biodiesel and the glycerin, so it's hanging in both of those, and it can cause all kinds of problems. It's much easier to take out this free fatty acid up front than the soap at the very end. And when you're having problems, do a lot of samples, do a lot of troubleshooting. Do your homework. We say conduct a feasibility. If you're thinking about going up and getting into business, what is a feasibility study? You're looking at where am I going to get my feedstock, what's my market, who am I going to sell to, how much is it going to cost me to build this plant? How am I going to operate this plant? Am I going to make money? Am I going to lose money? What permits do I need? So you're basically doing your own feasibility study to figure out if it's wise to go commercial. Once you go start selling biodiesel, you're in a different level of production. Write a business plan. If you're going to go after any money from banks, SBA, any place, they're going to want to see your business plan. Investors are going to want to see it. Angel capitalists are going to want to see it. So you're going to have to do a business plan. So understand those two and how to do it. Do your research before you start your business. Don't start your business and then find out you ran out of money because you didn't know how much it was going to cost. If you're looking at financing, there's money available through USDA sometimes. You can get loan guarantees that give you cheaper loans with the bank. There's SBA loans, and sometimes there's even loans through the company, the state, or even local municipalities. Understand your markets. Sometimes it's very easy to figure out what markets will buy the biodiesel. I one time went to a hire company that says, hey, we're all ready to go, but we don't know who we can sell the biodiesel to. So I spent 2 days. We went to the city garage and said, hey, would you like to burn biodiesel? Oh yeah, it's not going to harm our trucks, is it? Educate them, great, they were fine with it. They had emergency generators that the city ran twice a year. And we said, well, wouldn't you rather run them on biodiesel? Oh yeah, we could run them on biodiesel, maybe a blend of 20% to start with. We went to a furniture company, it was a big furniture company, had 100 trucks. They were pushing green. And he says, why don't you run your trucks on biodiesel? So by the time we were done, we had their plant at least base loaded with a bunch of people wanting to buy biodiesel. So you have to find your market and understand what's going to trigger them to want to buy the product. And of course, meet all the regulations and permit. Nothing's worse than have someone knock on your door saying we're shutting you down because you don't have this permit. Especially when you have customers lined up. There's some reasons why to consider a feasibility study. A lot of times, like USDA, if you want to go for a loan guarantee, they're going to require a feasibility study. Various parts of a business plan. As you see, all these things you're going to want to figure out for yourself. This just puts a name to it. Marketing plan. That's who's your customer. Manufacturing plan. That's how you're going to make your biodiesel. What equipment are you use? Whose technology? So it's things you're already thinking of, but you put them in these words that make sense to the business industry. That's it. Any questions?